Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of the Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show, we'll revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Ike Eisenmann and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann. And today we are thrilled to welcome someone who is something of a TV historian, who was born into the industry, whose father, Harry Ackerman, was involved in the production of some of the greatest sitcoms in television history, such as Leave It to Beaver, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, The Monkees, and the Partridge Family, and whose mother, Elinor Donahue, was one of the stars of the classic sitcom Father Knows Best. Please help us welcome Peter Ackerman. Peter, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you both for having me today. Appreciate it.
Well, to start with, and we stopped you from talking about it beforehand, to start with, before we talk about anything else, you said you served Ike before when you worked at Hamburger Hamlet in the early 80s. I want to know how he was, and more importantly, did he leave a nice tip?
No, I don't really remember. I think a colleague of mine who was working that day was really excited. If I have my years right, Ike had been in the Star Trek movie that you appeared in.
Okay.
And that really excited a friend of mine that I was working with. And he was jealous that I was serving your table. You were there with a woman, and whether it was an agent or a girlfriend, spouse, don't know, but that's all I remember.
Well, you know, the thing is, that's such a great restaurant to bring up, because if anyone who's ever lived in Los Angeles long enough knows about Hamburger Hamlet, that was quite literally, to this day in my mind, the best hamburger I've ever had anywhere, and I craved them. So I went frequently, and that must have been the one in shoot, I'm trying to remember, was it like Encino or Van Nuys or
the Sherman Oaks on Van Nuys
Boulevard? It wasn't Sherman Oaks. Okay, yeah, because my family and I used to frequent the one in, on the other side of the hill too, quite often when I was much younger. But what a great restaurant, and hey, awesome memory. Thanks.
Sure.
Well, did Ike leave a good tip? That's what I wanted to find out.
I'm sure.
So, we normally ask people if they come from backgrounds, and families which encourage the love of the arts. We know that yours did. So you grew up in a showbiz family. Let's discuss your parents. Did you grow up thinking that everyone had these experiences that you did, or did you realize that this is not the norm?
In the beginning, I thought everybody's mother was on television because, yeah, and one of my earliest memories was sitting on my mom's lap, and Father Knows Best, a rerun was on, and it used to rerun every weekday on Channel 5 in Southern California. And her character of Betty Anderson, the oldest daughter on the show, came through the doors, and she said, "Look, honey, look, there's mommy." And so I saw my mother in black and white, and that was only a few years before I was born, and so she looked the same. And I just assumed, and it wasn't until a few years later, I asked my friend who lived a couple of houses away, his name was Johnny, and I said, "Johnny, my mom's on Channel 5 at 4 o'clock. When's your mom on?" And that's when he said, yeah. And he's like, "Peter, not everybody's mom's on television." And that's when I'm like, oh.
Oh my, that's incredible. Jeez. Well, as a kid, what were some of the first shows that you remember your parents being involved with?
I think the biggest ones by the time I was born were Bewitched, and The Flying Nun was being done around the time that I was able to go to the studio and watch television. And so those were two shows that really I carry a lot of memories with, and Bewitched was a set I went to a lot. My dad, darn it, I wish I had talked to my dad more deeply about his production work before he died back in 1991, because there were so many holes for me. He had this special, I'll call it, role at Screen Gems, where he was both executive producer of certain shows, but then he helped advise on other shows. And I think he was a vice president for a brief period of Screen Gems. And so his name is always affiliated with shows like the Monkees, but I don't know what, if anything, he did regarding the show. So his name's not on the credits. So I just don't know. But
Dad was also involved with Hanna-Barbera, right?
For a brief period. Yeah. My dad went through a real tough road. After Bewitched ended, he kind of limped with one more try at a series, and then really couldn't get a job, and had to kind of hustle for a while. And he got under contract at Hanna-Barbera, and the only thing I remember, I don't remember him producing anything there, but I remember getting a tour of the animation department, which they still had back then. And so that's part of my dad and part of the world I grew up in. And again, the shows that I was affiliated with was Bewitched and The Flying Nun when I was young.
Yeah, I want to talk about your mom. You just mentioned that you used to watch her on, Hannah, on Father Knows Best, and she was also recently on Andy Griffith right beforehand too. So what's that like, just to see your mom? I mean, besides being a kid and one thing, then she's someone's love interest in in something else. So what's that like for you at that time?
Yeah, because that early memory that I already shared, it's not weird. When I see my mother engaged with somebody on TV or kissing, it's just kind of the way it was. So I kind of knew that the same time I was knowing her. So it was not strange. It was not like any of us now. If my wife, for instance, suddenly became an actress, to see her in the arms of another man would kind of freak me out a little bit. But that was just what mom did for a living as an actress. So it wasn't weird.
I will say with Andy Griffith's show, it was already completed by the time I was a kid, but it was like new to me since I watched it in syndication. And I remember being upset when your mom was no longer on the show and there was a new person there.
Yeah, and she was only on for the first season. She played Andy's girlfriend in the first season, and that was around a year before I was born, because she was really tired. She was the only cast member to have gone from Father Knows Best, which I think did 6 or 7 seasons. And then each season was like 40 some episodes or something like that. And she went right from that into the Andy Griffith show. And she was going to be getting married to my dad. And she was just tired and wanted a break. And so and the Andy Griffith show, if you watch in order the first season's episodes, it's just really interesting because you can see the writers and producers kind of trying to find their norm. It's when Don Knotts gets introduced, he was supposed to be, I think, a brief character on the show, but suddenly they decided to make him a regular. And then my mom was still there, and so they started giving him some of her lines. And she kind of saw the writing on the wall that her part was going to be diminished. And just for the reasons I said, was kind of sick could I be let out of my contract so I could get married and start a family. And they allowed her, and that's what she did.
Well, your dad was involved in some capacity or other with so many classic shows, like we mentioned, even before you were like I Love Lucy, Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, Leave It to Beaver. Do you remember him talking about any of those shows or his experiences on them?
He rarely, just so rarely, he would talk about Jack Benny, but really in throwing out about his comic timing. He would talk about what great comic timing he had, but he wouldn't talk about the good old days. My dad was a guy who, I recently learned from another producer, that he used to call his shows, what do you call them? Projects? Not projects, something else. Back then, let's take Burns and Allen or Jack Benny, you had an advertiser, and the advertiser was paying for the show. And so he was delivering a product to the advertiser. And so he saw what he was doing, not as this art so much, or this thing that would last throughout history so far, but he saw it as a product. And when the product's produced and the widget is made, you move on. And so he never stayed anchored in the past. He would just be working on the current project. And so that's, again, he never brought up on his own things that I wish I could ask him now.
I agree with your dad. I think Jack Benny probably had the best timing of anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, of course it's perfect because you don't notice it.
Yes.
But what was the first set you remember visiting?
The first set was Batman, because I was a big fan of the show, and my dad, the executive producer of Batman, was William Dozier, and apparently Bill Dozier had worked on a show of my dad's. I think it was the Donna Reed show. And so there was a connection. And because I was a big fan, my dad made a day to go to the studio. And I'll never forget it. It was kind of a huge day, having to do with two shows that I had hoped to go to the set for. One was the Monkees and the other was Batman. And when we got to the guard shack, and I've actually read this in a history book of the Monkees, we got to the guard shack, I guess that was a 20th century. And then they only had like a wooden, thing that went up and down to let cars in and out, just plain wood that a guard would walk out and push up. And it had been knocked down, and it was tossed over to the side. And my dad asked the guard what happened, and the guard said, "Oh, that Peter kid from the Monkees, he ran through it this morning." And so as we drove on the lot, my mom looked at my dad, and my brother and I were in the back seat. And I could see that she was doing it for our benefit. And she said, "I don't think we're going to that set today." And so
no.
I did get backstage once later on in life, but going on to Batman was great. And again, I'm kind of glad, because at the age I must have been, I mean, I was born in 62, so Batman 67, 68, I wasn't very old, but I understood television was pretend. And so I wasn't shocked. They were filming on a specially created set that day, but it was opposite the interior of Wayne Manor. And so my brother and I were able to walk to the elevator and look down and see that down below us wasn't the Batcave. It was just a couple of big kind of sofa pillows to stop their slide. And I think to myself now as an adult that could really shock a kid. But for me, it was like, okay, that's how they do it. All right. And I watched them film, and Adam West came over and took a picture with us, and I still have that. And Did you get to go on the Batcave set as well? I did not. At least I didn't see it on whichever soundstage we were on that day.
Now, when you go to these sets, are you allowed to mingle? You said Adam West came over and met you. I'm curious about Adam West too, how he was. But are you told that you're allowed to interact? Are you told to basically stay out of the way unless we tell you to?
Well, I always knew if I go onto a set, which hasn't happened in a while, but if I go on a set, I know the etiquette, which is, keep quiet, turn your cell phone off, don't jingle the change in your pockets, the whole bit. But then we were obviously special guests of the producer. And so I was, again, with my dad and my mom and my older brother. And so when Adam West came over, he probably was prompted to do so. But he was quite nice, as I recall, and nice later on in life when I met him and had him sign the picture. He was so funny because he was, as an older fella, he was still like Batman. He looked at the picture, and I made a joke, hey, we've met before. I've got the proof. And I showed this little boy, and he looked at the picture, and he looked at my mother, who was recognizable. She still looked in the father knows best type look. And he said, "This woman here, I recognize her." And I said, "Well, that's my mother." And I explained who she was. And he was just great. That little Sherlock Holmesian part of him just never went away. And so he was great. Loved him.
Did you ever push your parents to want to be an actor then at that age? Like you want to be in some of their shows?
I didn't. The push happened more the opposite way. And I think I was told this story so I didn't get any wise ideas. They had determined that they were not going to push us into the industry. And my brother Brian, he was 6 years older than me, and apparently he was with my mom. He had a different father, and my dad adopted him. But Brian was on the set of Andy Griffith Show, and he would play with Ron Howard, and they needed some kids for an upcoming episode, speaking parts, and they went and asked my mom. They said, "How about we make Brian an actor and have him do the speaking part?" And my mom said, "No, we're not gonna. He can make that decision when he gets old enough." And that's what they did. I just did it on my own in high school plays. That was enough, that sort of thing. And then when I was 18 and went to junior college to study theater, they saw that I was serious about it, and then kind of helped open doors, introduced me to an agent here or there for an interview, that sort of thing. My dad did cast me a couple of times on something, so I had that little nepotism hurdle up. But
on Gidget, right? That was the one, the new Gidget.
The new Gidget, my dad's last series, and it started off as a TV movie, a syndicated TV movie called Gidget's Summer Reunion. And Vince Van Patten played this bad guy surfer, and he had two buddies with him. And so I got to be one of the buddies. And then on the series, I got to play a couple, just brief, short.
I had actually watched that series. I remember watching it at the time.
Then you saw me.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned that Bewitched was your favorite set to visit. What made that one so special?
It was like family because first of all, Elizabeth Montgomery was married to the director and producer of the show, Bill Asher. Mm-hmm. And the Ashers and their children were friends with my family. And in fact, the Ashers would come over to the Ackerman home almost every Sunday. And we, in the summer, we'd play in the pool. And it got to the point that we called them Uncle Bill and Aunt Liz. That's how close we were. And in fact, they became the godparents to my baby brother.
Oh, well.
And I guess my mother reminded me recently that there was a competition between her and Liz, my mom and Liz, because they each wanted to have a girl, and my mom ended up having 4 boys. And whenever they would get pregnant, it was always around the same time, they were each hoping to beat the other out and get the girl. And Elizabeth won and had Rebecca, who's a talented director these days. And what was I going to say? So it was family. It was already there was the family. And my dad, I learned over time, and then by branching out on my own, which we'll probably get to, I learned that every set, particularly in a series, I'm guessing in a film, has a different character, just like each audience on a given night has a different character when an actor walks out on a stage. My dad's sets were very much like family. He hired good people, and he expected them to do good jobs. And except for probing questions about something as the producer, he would step back and let people do their thing. And so it was quite a fun and family type set. People weren't competing against one another. I've seen that on a show. Vying for the attention of the producers kind of thing. Everybody just did their job, and it was family. And so that was what I got from it later in life. I realized as I reflect back as an adult and through my own other experiences, how much of a family those sets were. And then again, I was the executive producer's kid, but Endora, now I'm forgetting her name, the actress who played Sam's...
Agnes Moorehead.
Agnes Moorehead.
Yeah.
So nice, so very nice. And she, would get down in front of me and talk to me. And she was just very nice. And my earliest memory on the Bewitched set is my second favorite. And Liz was playing Serena that episode. So you know that she played a dual role, and Serena was the cousin with a black wig and kind of a hippie outfit. And I didn't know it was Aunt Liz. So this actress walks up to me and she gets down on my level and she says, "Well, young man, I don't know who you are. Tell me your name." And she's totally in character. And I said, "Hi, I'm Peter Ackerman. My dad is Harry Ackerman, the executive producer." And she said, "Nice to meet you." And she goes, "Tell me, what's the star of the show really like?" And I said, "She's really nice." And so that was a good answer. That to me just that's the kind of set it was. And when I was on the set, I knew my dad would tell certain folks that I was there, and he would let me sit in his director's chair and tell me to stay out of trouble, and I would. So that's.
First of all, before I go ask anything else, I have to ask which show was it that people were vying for attention all the time?
I almost don't want to say. I've worked in a number of them. And in some capacity or another, and I'd rather not say, just non-disclosure agreement type things.
Not a problem.
I was going to ask rhymes with, but
yeah, he always does that. Right. I have mine too that I wish to not discuss. So there you go.
we've had on Erin Murphy, who played Tabitha. Did you have much interaction with her, or like when you were kids?
Never as a kid. I don't know if my visits didn't line up with Tabitha episodes or what. So I didn't meet her until I used to go to autograph shows just to meet again these people who worked with my parents. And she was at one of them. And this was many years ago when she started first doing them. And that's when we met. So we met well after. But we're still friends today.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Agnes as well. How did the rest of the cast treat you?
Very nice. Except for Paul Lind, and that wasn't on Bewitched, but my dad, I will jump he did. See, when Bewitched ended, due to Elizabeth and Bill's divorce, it ended a season early. And so in order to fulfill the contract for the advertisers, they created a show, he and Bill, called the Paul Lind Show. And so that was a one-season show. And I went and had kind of a master class. I was about 10 or 11 years old, because I sat, it was filmed before a live audience on Fridays, but I sat in the stands from Tuesday through Friday and watched every rehearsal, because I was off of school that week. And so I really got to see how a production went from after table read into getting on its feet. And at one point, probably on that Tuesday, my dad took me behind the set and introduced me to some of the other actors. And he walked me over to Paul Lind, and he was sitting in his director's chair reading his paper. And my dad said, "Paul, I'd like you to meet my son, Peter." And I stuck out my hand like I was taught to. And he just looked at me and sneered and said, "Hello," and put his paper back up and gave it a nice flick. And that escorted me away.
Jeez.
But the other actors were great. I mean, the only one I really remember meeting on set, I've met so many of the Bewitched actors, sometimes just out about town, as you would say, when I lived in LA, other times at autograph shows. Of all things, he was in one episode, I think, was Bert Convy, who later became famous for game shows like Tattletales. And Bert Convy was on an episode, and he was playing Paul Revere. So I less have this memory because he was Bert Convy, but he was playing Paul Revere, and I was a kid, that was a hero as the way I was brought up. And so Dad introduced me to him. And that moment was kind of funny because, gosh, you just took me back. So I'm meeting Bert Convy, who's dressed as Paul Revere on the Bewitched set. And he's getting a donut and some coffee, and he shakes my hand, makes some small talk with my dad and I, and he goes off, and my dad maybe is talking to somebody else. And I look down, and there's this other actor who was a guest actor on that episode as well. And here's another name I don't recall right off the bat, but the fella who played Dr. Smith on Lost in Space.
Isn't it Jonathan Smith? Isn't it this?
Jonathan something.
Yeah.
You'll have to look it up. But And he was sitting there, and he looked at me, and I'm sure he was just trying to be friendly. But I had watched Lost in Space, and he was a scary, mean guy. And he looked at me and he said from his chair, "Hello." And that just freaked me out. And I just turned around.
All it would
and
take for me too.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's funny with the Paul Lynde stuff. We've had on other people, and I loved Paul Lynde as a kid. And everyone that we've spoken to about Paul Lynde seems to have the same kind of story as you just mentioned, with that he had a lot of dark sides to him. Yeah. But getting back to Bewitched, all right, so some of this behind the scenes stuff we had during our email exchanges, you would kind of like alluded to it, like, about some behind the scenes. I want to know what type of things that you were privy to, like, the two Darrens, relationship drama, some of the things that you were aware of at the time.
I wasn't growing up. Dad didn't bring home his work so much. And maybe that was just the way my parents had their schedules. We Ackerman boys would eat at like 6 o'clock or something like that. And then Dad and Mom would sit and eat dinner later, like around 8 o'clock. Sometimes on TV trays as they watched something on television. So they didn't talk shop much. So by the time I was aware of it, I know I've seen, as a young boy, I saw Dick York episodes, but by the time I was aware of it and meeting somebody on the set, it was Dick Sargent. So it was after the fact that I learned what my dad helped to do, because we watch Bewitched today and we see you watch one episode and then the next episode and Darren just flips each time. And it can be off-putting, but what they did, and this was, I think, quite brilliant. So Dick York was having his problems, and they kept having to write around him. So they had a bunch of episodes without him, and with Samantha on the phone talking to him. So his character was present, but he was never seen. And what they decided to do was, over the summer, when everybody was showing reruns back in the day, they showed new Bewitched episodes, but the only episodes they showed were episodes without Darren. And so over the summer, you had Darrenless episodes, at least by face. And then in the fall, the new season started and Dick Sargent walked through the door. And so it was easier for the viewer at the time, who was only watching the show once a week. There was no VCRs or what have yous, and they weren't in reruns yet. So you only got to see it on that particular night. So that helped Dick Sargent to be better accepted than he might otherwise have been. And he's the only one who I knew, and he was a lovely, lovely man. And I actually got to act with him in one of my brief acting roles on another series. Great guy. And what I saw in Bewitched was the end happening. Unfortunately, the scene I watched being filmed was never used in the final episode, but it is in what's the final season. And it started off as a great day. Dad dropped me off at the set and in his director's chair, and I sat between Liz on one side and Dick Sargent on the other as they were waiting to film the first season of first shot of the day, first scene of the day. And in the meantime, they had the LA Times, each of them, and there was a puzzle in there, probably still is in there, called Jumble. And it was a word jumble puzzle. And they were trying to figure out the final riddle. And they kept asking me, what do you think this word means? And what do you think the final riddle is? And just a great visit. So fun. And then they were called to set. So they went to the set, and just before they started filming, Elizabeth said, hold on a minute, hold on, I got to check my script. And she ran over to her chair, which was next to me, and she opened up her script, and she leaned over to me and said, the answer to the riddle is, and she gave me the answer and said, don't tell Dick I told you. And so when he came back, when they did the first shot or whatever, had to relight, he came back still scratching his head over. And I said, I think the answer is, and I gave him what Liz told me. And he goes, you're right. And he looked at me and goes, Liz told you, didn't she? Yes. And so that's just a really great memory, and it says everything I've already kind of said about my dad's sets. But then something happened. They were filming this part of the scene where it turns out the arc of the episode had to do with the fact that Samantha, as a witch, was allergic to something that they served in this Chinese restaurant. And she passes out into Darren's hands on the way out. She, I think, gets spots first and then passes out. And when she passed out, she kind of did a spiral down and leaving her tushy sticking out. She was wearing probably brown slacks or something. And her husband, Bill Asher, was not directing that day, but another fellow was directing. And when she spiraled down with her rear end facing his direction, he went, "Oh, Liz, honey, I could watch you do that all day."
Oh.
And yeah, it was, again, I'm a kid, and didn't realize then I lived a very sheltered life, and I didn't know anybody who was divorced, or the word infidelity wasn't in my vocabulary. But I knew something wasn't right, because that was my Aunt Liz, and she did for a living what my mom did for a living. And I couldn't imagine any man saying that with my mom, to my mom, or my mom laughing in sort of the gentle way that Liz did with this guy. It was, and they had a good laugh over it, and the crew laughed, kind of a friendly laugh. Maybe it was a nervous laugh, I don't know, but something was up. And then I learned, because a couple days later at home, it seems like it was a couple days later, it could have been a week later or two, but the show was ending. And I only know that because I used to walk around our house, and I was one of those kids who's like really quiet. And so I would just listen. And my mom was in this particular room where my dad and her were having breakfast, and he was called to the phone by one of us. And he went and grabbed the phone, and it was Liz, and he talked, and I heard him say, no, I'm not going to do that to my partner. I'm sorry. Okay, then. And he hung up the phone and went back to my mother, and I heard her say, "What was that all about?" And he said it was Liz, and she's saying the Screen Gems wanted the show to go on one more season. And by then, as my dad explained to my mom, and I heard that Liz was having an affair with this other director, and so that was leading to her marriage and Bill's marriage to split up. And thus the show was going to end. But Liz said to my dad, "I'll tell you what, if you'll make this other director into the producer, I'll do one more season of the show." And my dad said, "No, I've worked with Bill, and he's my partner. I'm not going to do that to him." And so my dad said, "Bewitched is over." And that was the case. And I think it's a funny anecdote. You can tell me if it's not. I probably caused more problems, because later that day, Bill Asher came over with their children, and their children were playing in the backyard and with me. And William, or now I knew him as Willie, but his name is William. I was talking to him, and I said, "Did you hear about your parents?" Like, duh. And I wasn't mean-spirited. It was again, I paint myself in this season of innocence. And he goes, yeah, they're splitting up. They told us that they love us very much. And I said, "I heard your mom was in love with this other director." And he just kind of went, oh, okay. He kind of just took it in. But the next time they were supposed to come over was Christmas morning, and the car pulls up, and only Bill Asher walks in the house. And my mom says, where's the kids?" And he looked at her and said, "Liz doesn't want them coming over here anymore." And to this day, I have no idea. I don't know if that's just because it's part of the divorce and you split your friendships and your loyalties, and Dad wouldn't let the show go on. So maybe that's why. Or was it that Willie went home and said to his mom, "Peter Ackerman says you're in love with another man."
Wow.
By the way, it was Jonathan Harris from Lost in Space.
Lost in Space.
Right. So your dad was also involved in the production of I Dream of Jeannie. correct?
No, that I don't think. I've heard that sometimes, and I don't know unless it fell into. I don't know that it was a Screen Gem show. It was around the same time he was doing Bewitched,
Right.
and unless he was an advisor because of his Screen Gems affinity, that I don't know.
Huh. Well, I mean,
The only way where I will say that there's probably something there is I do remember, and I cannot find it. We used to have a picture of, it was my dad and mom, Liz Montgomery and Bill Asher, and Larry Hagman and Jeannie, Barbara Eden, playing touch football at the studio. They were all kind of in tennis whites, and they were playing touch football. And so there must have been something to the fact that my dad had something to do with the show, but I have no idea what it is.
Well, was there any discussion from the cast of Bewitched about how similar the shows were?
I've heard that there was, and people weren't happy with it. It was nowadays. I mean, not nowadays. Boy, am I dating myself. It became the norm in the 70s. If ABC had a hit show, NBC and CBS made their version of it. That became kind of, and then it became that just the network made its own copycats of its own series, you know, all the NCIS series and such. But yeah, back then it was new, making such a direct sort of copy. But, you know, they were making a product, as my dad would say, and I guess they went on and did what they were doing.
Well, you touched upon before, you know, Sally Field and the Flying Nun. So did you get to meet her at all, and you know, some of your memories?
I did, much to her probably consternation, because first time I met her was while the show was going on. I went to the set a few times. My mother was cast as her older sister on a few episodes of the series, and that's when I would go to the set. And Sally came over to our house once. There was some huge party happening, and it was the party where I fell in love with the business. And I said to myself, I want to be a part of this my whole life. And I remember my dad lifting me up and saying, Peter, do you know who this is? And I said, your sister Betril. And she laughed and shook my hand. And she, how do I say this? Over time, she unwittingly, so I don't want to put anything on her, she unknowingly disappointed my dad. My dad felt, and he shared with me, the stories he did share about Gidget were about how frightened she was the first day of shooting, and how dad had her come over from the set into his office. And he said, you know, we cast you in this because we know you can do this. It's going to be okay. And gave her some kind of pep talk, and she went in and became famous. And when my dad was struggling, he couldn't find a job to save his soul, as I like to say. She won an Academy Award, one of the Academy Awards she won. And I think, again, she doesn't owe it to my dad, but he was looking for some recognition. The business had seemed to forget him. And here was Sally Field, a woman who he helped get on into front of her first camera. And all she really thanked in her speech was Burt Reynolds. And my dad was crushed. And I don't put anything on her. It's her award. She can thank who she wants. And then her book came out a few years back, and she didn't know my dad the way I've talked about him. My dad comes off as a sort of Howard Hughesy type character who is in the shadows only, and everybody gets tense when he comes on set. And that's not the experience I had on his sets. And but that's hers, so that we have to own that. I have to own that she's entitled to her own perspective. But I was so personally upset by that vision of my dad being in a book that I knew a lot of people were going to read when she was signing. I was living in Northern Virginia at the time. She was signing and giving a talk at a place, a synagogue of all places, in Washington, D.C. So I paid for a package, which included a ticket and a signed book. And I went, and boy, when they said, "Are there any questions from the audience?" I got behind the first microphone on my side, and I just introduced who I was. And where I got gratification on behalf of my dad was Sally, as you might know, kind of likes to put her TV years behind her and really embrace her movie career. And so I brought up who my dad was, and Gidget, and The Flying Nun, and some of the other shows he executive produced. And the crowd, her crowd, went nuts. They were so appreciative of those shows. And so that, I don't think she was happy, but it needed to be done for me. It was some kind of having, as a young man, see my dad almost cry, feeling dejected by the industry that so easily forgets its own history. I just had to do that. So I went everywhere with that question. So
no, it's good. Well, I want to go back. You mentioned the Batman set, how great it was to visit there. There's another one that I'm curious about, if you got to go on. Your mom did a guest on Star Trek. Did you get to go on to that?
No, I didn't. I was probably so young. Yeah, I didn't. And she worked, that was a couple of weeks she worked because she got sick. Right when they cast her, she got the flu or something. And I don't know if they shot parts around her and then had her come in and do her roles, but there's a iconic in the episode's called Metamorphosis. I think it's third season. It might be second season. And she wears this scarf around her head and her neck. And fans remember that. And it's colored this kind of bluey, it's very Star Trek original series looking. And apparently the reason why she wore it is because she had lost weight when she had the flu, and they wanted to cover that up. But I've been to signings with her, and fans will come up with their own version of that scarf. And so it's sort of an iconic thing that was an afterthought. But no, I didn't get to go. The closest I got to a Star Trek experience was in 2016. My mother decided at some point, she has been acting. I mean, she's been on the stage since she was like 3 or 4 years old. She was at the end of vaudeville. And then she was in movies when she was 7, and was under contract at MGM when she was 9. So she's been acting for her whole life. She's now 86. And a few years back, she just said, I kind of want to be done. And I want to just call it done. And so she has, but she doesn't even want to go out and meet fans necessarily, but that makes her autograph a little rarer than other folks. And so the Star Trek convention in Las Vegas, they do every year. There was one year where they wanted her to be one of the main attractions. And so I don't know, I don't discuss money with my mom. That was a rule I learned early on when my brother asked her how much she made. And, don't ask mom that. And but they put her under contract for the day. So it was like Saturday, she would take pictures with the fans, sign pictures with the fans, be on the stage and interviewed for this and do that thing, and meet with the VIP people over here. And she got a blanket fee for all that. And so she said, okay, I'll do that, as long as she negotiated to have one of her sons go with her, because she didn't want to be bored. And she chose me. One, I was available. Two, she and I are very close in many ways. And I get what she needs. And at some times she needs to have her spirits kind of lifted, and others I know she wants to talk about anything but show business. And so well chosen. But because of that, I spent a day and a half with her at the Star Trek convention backstage and got to meet at least Leonard Nimoy's son and some of the DS9 cast members and such. So that was a treat for me. That's as close as I've done.
Very cool. Well, you mentioned the Monkees briefly, and growing up, the Monkees and the Partridge Family were among my favorite shows, and your dad was involved in both. So I want to start with the Monkees. So you said you don't know what involvement you have. So you don't know if he was part of the process with auditions or anything like that?
I don't know. All I know is that he would bring home from Screen Gems advanced copies of albums. And so I would get free Monkees albums and free Partridge Family albums. And yeah, so I don't know what he did, and never had a chance to learn anything about them. One day he came home and said, Mickey Dolenz came in, he wanted a meeting, and I had a meeting with him today. And I was so young, I didn't ask him what they talked about. But the good news is that kind of to make the circle come around, and I never thought of asking. I could have asked Mickey Dolenz. I realize that now that I had a chance to do that. I worked in TV production for a while, and my the producer I worked for got backstage passes and tickets to a Monkees show, some tie with Mickey Dolenz' manager. And so I went with him. I was his plus one and got to go backstage at the Monkees concert when it was Mickey, Peter, and Davey, and got to hang out and talk to Mickey.
Oh, wow.
And so I got my Monkees time, but I really don't know my dad's connection except for his advisory aspect on Screen Gems. And who knows what he advised for that show, because it was all over the place.
So then you weren't privy to any of the goings on behind the scenes where they were fighting for more control of their music or any of that stuff?
No, I was way too young.
Mm-hmm.
62 Monkees was probably like Batman in 68, 67-ish. So I was not aware of that.
How about the Partridge Family? You ever get to go on there and talk to any of them?
So around the time my dad was an advisor for certain shows, he had some job at Paramount, and I don't know if that's what tied him into the shows or not, but I went to Catholic school. And so what was great about Catholic school is that the holidays were always different from the public schools. And so my holidays were weeks when the studios and the shows were in operation. So when I had the week after Easter off, I'd get to go with my dad to the studio. And when he worked at Paramount, it was great. And I got to go to Happy Days, Partridge Family,
wow,
and got to meet them. And, not great relationships or anything, but I got to meet the cast, including Shirley Jones. And one day I went with a school buddy, and Dad dropped me off on the Partridge Family set and said, "I'll be back to pick you boys up," and introduced me to David Cassidy before he left. And David said he wasn't in the scene they were filming, and he said, "Hey, come over here, guys." And we sat down on the couch with him. He says, "I'm working on this new song." And he started playing the song and singing. I have no idea what it was or if it ever got published, but yeah, I got to hang out and sing with David Cassidy. I mean, that's
were you aware of how big he was at that time? I mean,
I knew all the girls in my school loved him, and so yeah.
Oh God. Well, one of our all-time favorite shows is The Odd Couple, and your mom had a recurring role on that. So what are some of your memories of that show?
Memories of going there, again, when I was at Paramount, whether to visit her specifically or while she was filming there and Dad was also working on the lot. Yeah, I'd go and hang out, and those are always fun shows. Always very frenetic, I think is the word I'm looking for, because they were always rewriting. Gary Marshall was such a stickler for comedy and what was funny and what wasn't funny, and they had to see how the actor read the line to see if it would work. And Mom was always carrying around her script and a pencil, and everybody was, because they were always changing dialogue. Up until filming it in front of the audience, they'd be changing dialogue. And she would tell me sometimes, very quietly, watch out, Jack's not in a very good mood today. Or she would give me a prep. She trusted me. She would say, I'm going to introduce you to so-and-so and so-and-so, and kind of give me some background of who might be pleasant and who might not be, and not to take that personally. And Jack Klugman was fine, but he was comparatively gruff to Felix. Tony Randall. Tony Randall was usually marvelous, and I never saw him. He we're talking about professionals, and he was a professional. He could get into a snit if something wasn't going right. I understand, but I never saw that. So they were always good memories. She met John Lennon on the set of The Odd Couple. And
oh, wow.
For years, until I sold it, I owned the autograph that she got. And people know about John Lennon's Lost Weekend, it's called, when he came to LA for a while with May Pang. And one day he went to Paramount, and I've seen pictures of his visit to the Happy Days set. And apparently that day, Gary Marshall went over to the Happy Days set and said, come over to The Odd Couple. We're doing a run through in half an hour. And so my mom suddenly looked up, and there's this Beatle sitting in the front row with Julian Lennon and as it turns out, May Pang. And she grabbed her script, tore off the back page, and had her pencil handy. And she said, would you sign this for my boys? And so it was to Brian, Peter, James, and Chris, love, John Lennon. So I had that for years. Wow,
that's great. So you mentioned you eventually went into TV as well. So what were some of the first projects that you were involved with?
The first, when I first decided to get into production, it was at the end of, or in the second of 2 seasons for the new Gidget. Mm-hmm. My dad had either had a bad knee or I think he had back surgery, and he couldn't drive for 2 weeks. So I left my Hamburger Hamlet gig as a server and went and became my dad's driver. And it was the second time in my life that I had that adult class at what an executive producer does. And I had been trying to be an actor and did a few things, but was waiting tables. And so I suddenly said, oh, I like this side of the business. So my first doorway into the business was becoming a production assistant on commercials and music videos. And then after about 5 years, because that was really hopping in the late 80s, early 90s, in 1991, after my dad died, I got hired on my first series as a production assistant, and it didn't last long. It was called The Human Target, and it starred Rick Springfield. And I did that. Then I went and worked on the Sinatra miniseries for 6 months. And then I started working for Warner Brothers and would get farmed out during pilot season to become a production coordinator for this pilot or that pilot. And then when I was kind of done in that main production department work, I guess the first show I went on was just briefly. I was a fill-in writer's assistant on Full House during the last season for about 3 months during their last season. And I wasn't very good as a writer's assistant. And so I knew that they weren't going to keep me as soon as they found somebody of quality once other shows started getting canceled. So I started looking, and then that enabled me to go right to become the production coordinator during the first season of the Wayans Brothers. Oh, you remember that show?
I do remember that. Yes.
And that was an experience. And I had a friend named Todd Stevens, and during pilot season, before I got onto the Wayans Brothers, Todd had 2 shows he was overseeing, and one was with Ralph Macchio, the Karate Kid actor, and another with the coordinator was my friend Mary. And it was this show about these pals, and my show didn't get picked up, so that's why I was looking for work and found the Wayans Brothers. Well, at the end of the Wayans Brothers season, Todd called me and said, "Hey, Petey, I need a new assistant on on the show I'm doing. My assistant worked with me only for the first year of the series, and we're going on to a second year. Do you want to come be my assistant? And his show was the #1 show. So I went from the last place show to Friends. So I worked on Friends for seasons 2 and 3. So
what are some of your memories of that show?
Oh gosh, an inordinate amount of time in the office. Todd was a workaholic, which made me a workaholic on his behalf. And he might go down to the set, but I was always in the office. So I kind of rue that fact. That the cast, if the cast showed up today, if you had a cast member of Friends on here and you'd say, look, we've got Peter Ackerman here, they'd say, who's that? Because I never made it to the set. except on show nights I'd come down. But my favorite story of not being recognized was Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders. Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders was doing a guest spot on the show, and for whatever reason, Todd was working with her assistant, which meant I was working with her assistant to make sure they wanted to give Chrissy a really good experience because she was going to do TV. This rock star was going to do TV. And he told me, Petey, I want you showing up in the morning to greet them and make sure everything in the dressing room is working and that they're happy. And I said, okay. So I go down there and I meet the assistant, meet Chrissy, take them up to their dressing room, and fix something that wasn't working, called the telecom department, whatever it was. And, I had my CD to be signed and all that. And just as the assistant took me over to do that with Chrissy, in walked Lisa Kudrow. And I guess part of the episode was they were going to sing Smelly Cat, the song from Friends. And so Lisa wanted to teach Smelly Cat to Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders. And so the assistant went to introduce everybody to everybody. And so she said, Chrissy, this is Lisa Kudrow. Lisa, this is Chrissy. And then she looked at Lisa and me and said, of course, you two know each other. And Lisa Kudrow looked at me, and she could get that sneer. It was kind of natural, but she goes, no, who are you? And I had to say, I'm Peter from Todd's office. I'm the voice on the phone every time you call him. So that was just typical of that show. Nobody knew who I was.
Oh, geez. Well, during your time in the business, you come across so many people, and some of which were Burt Lancaster and Aerosmith and Peter Frampton. What stories can you tell us about them?
Oh, Burt Lancaster, I always answer as he was the most famous person I ever worked with. And it was just a silly commercial, but he was a man. It was near the end of his life. He was supposed to do a movie called The Old Gringo, and whichever studio, it might have been Warner Brothers, would not insure him. There was something about his health that was uninsurable, so he couldn't do the movie. And so he was now stuck doing commercials, and this was a commercial for insurance or something. And I'll never forget when I was asked to go get him from his trailer. We were walking in the set, and you go from sunlight into the dark kind of outer fringes of a set. For those who don't know, your lights, it takes a moment for your lights to adjust. And he walked, there was a red line. How do I describe this? There was a red line painted on the ground that you weren't supposed to walk in because there was equipment within that line. Well, he didn't see it. And so he accidentally walked in there, and he stubbed his boot on some equipment and stumbled. He didn't fall, thank God, but he stumbled. And he looked down, and with the greatest dignity, and he was still strong, even though it wasn't out of the line, he picked up the equipment as if it had been and tossed it back into the line. And he had such dignity. And thankfully, that was a good crew on that commercial, because I could have gotten in so much trouble, because the day before we had lit the set and did everything, because we were just going to shoot him that day. And then we had a location to go to with him. So it had to be all quick. So the day before we were setting up the set for Burt Lancaster, and the guy with the script on the monitor wanted to run through it. And he said, will somebody stand in the monitor and read the script? And it had some kind of, typical corny commercial line, like, that had to do with From Here to Eternity, and so I read it in his voice. I didn't do a spot on, but I was like, and if you get this insurance, it will last for you, if you'll pardon the expression, from here to eternity. And I did it, and the crew loved it, and we had fun with it. Well, the next day he goes on the set, and the director says, "Okay, Bert, we got the teleprompter here. Why don't we go through it? Why don't you read it and see how you like it?" And he did it exactly like I did it. I had spot on his timing and everything, from here to eternity. I mean, just spot on. And the crew busted up, and he got so mad. He's like, "What's funny?" And everybody got quiet, and somebody in the back said, "I'm sorry, I just had a problem here, sir. We're fixing it." And got me out.
Oh, geez.
He was not in on the joke and felt that we were laughing at him. And so,
yeah, sure. Oh my gosh.
He was great. And Aerosmith, when I worked on music videos, what a dream that was. So I'm one of the many guys who, at least for me, it was the Draw the Line album. And I would close my bedroom door in high school and put on Draw the Line album and pretend I was everybody, and especially the lead singer. So I'm working on the music video, Janie's Got a Gun. And this other production assistant and I are told to show up at this hotel in Beverly Hills, pick up these 2 vans, and take the band to the set. Well, the band happens to be Aerosmith, and Steven Tyler gets in the other person's car. I've got the rest of the band. And so I'm driving to this warehouse in downtown LA where we were filming the band concert footage for the Janie's Got a Gun video. And I'm driving Aerosmith. It was just amazing. And then I get on the set, and David Fincher was directing, and at some point he needed some lighting done, and he said to the assistant director, "Get me somebody up there." They didn't have stand-ins, and I was just a production assistant, so I'm just sweeping up, just looking busy, which is what you're supposed to do. And assistant director tells me to get up behind the microphone. So I'm behind Steven Tyler's microphone. It's draped with the scarves and everything. And I'm being, they're doing the lighting and the checking of this and that. And they're testing cameras because we had 2 going on at once. One was on a dolly below the stage, and one was on a overhead crane. And they were testing everything. And meanwhile, the band starts coming up out of hair and makeup. And so I've got all of Aerosmith standing around me. The drummer, all 3 guitarists, Joe Perry's right here next to me, everybody but Steven Tyler. And finally the director's like, "Where's Steven?" And they said, "Oh, he's in hair and makeup. He's going to be another 10 minutes. And the director said, "I just want to run through." And so he said, "Band, do what you're going to do in the video." And he points at me, "Just stay where you are." And so they do the playback. Of course, when you make music videos, you're not really playing live, you're playing to a track. And so the playback happens, and I get to mouth the words because the album came out the week before, and as a fan, I bought it. So I already knew the song. So I got to mouth the words behind the microphone and have the actual band members playing around me. And at the solo, Joe Perry even leaned up against me, da, da, da. And I got chills, man. It was like the best thing that ever happened to me in production.
That's great. And what about Frampton?
He was, when people ask who's the nicest person you ever worked with. So he had this was after Frampton Comes Alive, well after. And he still had his hair then. He's bald now. And what was the song? The song was called More Times Than One. And so we were doing a music video for that. And most of the crew was from England. And there were like 3 or 4 of us from LA. And I was the production assistant on it. So I worked on it. So it was a very small crew on this soundstage at Sunset Gower Studios. And he came on and did his thing. And at one point, he needed to string his guitars in, I guess the guitars he was using in the video, and he needed someone, so I was assigned to him. So I got to drape a Peter Frampton guitar around me as he's stringing it and tuning it and doing the whole thing. And then it got to this part in the video where he did a shot where he's sort of playing on his guitar and he sings the first line and he whips off his sunglasses, but he had to come back and strum. So he said, can I have somebody out of camera to take my sunglasses? So that's me. So every time I watch that video, more ways than one, and I see the sunglasses go off, I know that I'm right there grabbing them.
Oh, we have to look.
Yeah. And so that's basically the shoot. But then at the end, it was a 24-hour shoot, probably non-union crew. We shot for 24 hours or worked for 24 hours. And at the end, record executives showed up on this next morning and they've got champagne and cups and they're calling the department heads together, the head lighting fella and the grip and the makeup department and whomever else and the director. And they're pouring champagne, and of course, Peter Frampton. And I'm up putting stuff away. That was my job. And I'm sweeping and putting stuff away. And the record company executive said, and now I'd like to make a toast. And I hear Peter's voice say, hold on a second. And he comes running over and he takes my broom out of my hand and he puts it against the wall and he says, come here. And he brings me over to this group of all these people who I've been working for the last 24 hours. And he pours a glass of champagne and puts it in my hands, picks his one back up, and he says, now we can toast.
Oh,
that's great.
Man.
That's class. That's
Yeah.
class.
Well, you have stories about people that were good, and now I want to know if there's stories that you come across people that perhaps were not in the best of light. And, I'm not going to name names, but a certain Material Girl.
Right. That was just a nightmare of a shoot, but I'm so glad I did it. Madonna, and the music video is called Express Yourself, and it was high production. And it took, at Culver City Studios, it was 3 sound stages. Apparently they were sound stages where Orson Welles shot Citizen Kane, and it was 3 sound stages that could open up and they were linked if you wanted them to be, and they were. And we filmed so many days on that production, but she just wasn't nice. She is great, I understand, with other performers and with dancers. Of course, she has an affinity for dancers, but the rest of the crew, we shouldn't even be fed. We were non-union. There should probably be no food if we're non-union.
Wow. So, I do want to ask about a couple of series that your mom was on, which one which I loved in particular, Get a Life with Chris Elliott. So how did she become involved with that? And were you aware of him from Letterman at the time?
I wasn't. I'm a morning person, so I've never been a late night watcher. And if I was, it was Johnny Carson. So I never went over to the Letterman side. So no, I wasn't aware of who Chris Elliott was. And she did an audition. I mean, I think they wanted her, as I recall. And she auditioned and got the part, and she loved it. And it was oddly funny. As you know, one of the things they did in that series was Chris Elliott's dad, Bob Elliott, played his father, and my mother played his mother. And the parents wore pajamas, robes and pajamas the whole time. That was their wardrobe. And so she'd go to this. Sometimes she told me that she would go to this soundstage and not change. She'd get up in the morning, put on a bathrobe, and go to the soundstage and just be in ready to go in costume. And what happened once, I was filming across the street as a production assistant and told her, and she decided to come visit me. So in walks this woman in pajamas. This crew is working, filming whatever commercial we're filming, and in she walks, and I'm having to introduce her to everybody. This is my mother. And but most people knew who she was. So she was on, so that helps any embarrassment. It's like, Mom.
She was in another show earlier, which I wanted to ask about before, Mulligan Stew. Now, you were friends with Johnny Doran, right? And I know Ike knows John. I interviewed Johnny a couple of years ago for something else. So you were friends with him when he played her son, right?
Yeah. So in the pilot, other redhead kid,
Johnny Whitaker.
Johnny Whitaker was
Right.
cast as the son, but the age was supposed to be high school, and Johnny Whitaker was getting to be college age then. And so when it went to series, Johnny Dorn was recast as her son. And Johnny and I went to high school together. We were in the same class of Notre Dame High School in Sherman Oaks. And yeah, Johnny and I were friends. And so it was really cool because for the only time in my life, I was able to go to the set, not just to see my mom do her thing or my dad do his thing, but to hang out with somebody. And Johnny was great because when we were on a break, and this is probably when the school was on a Catholic school holiday because I was there. And so he probably didn't have to do the school part. And one day he says to me, "Hey, come here, you want to see something neat?" I said, "Yeah." And so we go a couple sound stages over, and Mulligan Stew was filmed at Paramount. And we go into this set, and they're just finishing putting in the last lights. And I knew what it was. You didn't have to tell me. I was on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, and it was for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And, the guy was putting it together. They knew Johnny because he came over there all the time, and we're talking to him. And I'm like, this is so cool. And so that's my Mulligan Stew memory.
Are you still friends with Johnny now?
Yeah, we talk. Social media helps make us friends. I can't call us deep friends, but when I was living in Northern Virginia, he and his wife were coming through because there was a concert they wanted to see at a small venue. And yeah, we got together for coffee. It was great.
Now, what made you leave? We didn't mention now at the top. I saved this for now. So you left the business and you became a priest. So what made you decide that this was, your calling in life?
Yeah, Hollywood to the priesthood. And
yes,
I'm an Episcopal priest. I always want to be, because people hear priest and they immediately think Roman Catholic and vows of celibacy. No, I'm not celibate. I have been married for 30 plus years. I think it's 36 this year. And my wife and I have 2 children who are adults now, our children. And in the Episcopal Church, priests can be married. And so what happened was I was working on Friends, and I had a great job and working with Todd. If you're on a hit show, you can get so many free things. And for instance, I think it was Nike supplied some of the sporting goods and clothing to our show. So we had a Nike representative that was assigned to Friends. And if I ever needed running shoes or something, all I had to do was pick up the phone and dial the Nike rep. And the next morning I would have whatever I asked for, plus extras, t-shirts and socks and whatever. So I'm on a hit show, and I'm a lifelong Episcopalian. My parents became Episcopalian when they got married and raised a family. And there was this person of faith within me. Even though I loved the showbiz world and felt that that's what I was called to, I found myself working on a hit show where I could get free things. I'm on a #1 show. I loved my family. I loved the church that I was then worshiping at and with. And I wasn't feeling as fulfilled in my vocation. There was something missing. My life wasn't complete. This work thing that I had striven for all my life, here I am, and I'm not happy. And so I took a leap of faith when, quite literally, when an opportunity came to work in Friends production office was housed in a building right outside of Warner Brothers. And that building manager, who I interacted with regularly as part of my job, said, "I'm looking for a new assistant." And she told me what the pay and the hours were and the benefits. The pay and the benefits were exactly the same as I was making on Friends. And the hours were a lot nicer because it was Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And so I'm like, oh, I'm going to go into property management and just take a break from showbiz. And so I did the property management thing for a year or so. And that definitely wasn't where my future was. But what happened then is my church was looking for somebody to come on staff part-time as a youth leader. And they asked me, would I be interested? And I said, yes. And I took that job, became the youth leader, grew the youth group. And it's like, how can I do this with my whole life? And then the church needed a parish administrator. And so I left property management, became the parish administrator. And suddenly I'm finding myself working 2 jobs in this church, and everybody, the priest, the people, my youth, are saying, have you ever thought of the priesthood? And I had been by that point. And so I went through what's called the discernment process in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, and obviously got through that. And the bishop at the time really wanted me to go to his seminary in Northern Virginia. In Alexandria, Virginia, is the aptly named Virginia Theological Seminary. And so after living 40 some years in my life in Los Angeles, my wife and our young kids and I moved for what was supposed to be 3 years to Virginia. And then we ended up staying because a church that I was doing an internship at wanted to hire me, and we liked it out there. And we ended up staying on the East Coast. And except for my wife and I returning briefly to California in 2019, we've made the East Coast our home.
That's great.
Well, what are some of the things that you're involved with now?
Well, I'm what's called a rector, R-E-C-T-O-R. So I'm staying in the church realm, and I'll tell you about something else I'm working on. A rector is the head priest of a church, and I'm the only priest, and so it's the administrative person, and so I'm running the church, and that's what I've been doing the last not 15 years, probably the last 10 years. I've been doing rector jobs, and my wife and I feel that this is our last stop. We love where we are. She's a licensed sommelier for wine and spirits, and she's got her job that she loves in Virginia, which is about an hour's drive away. Probably a shorter drive than if we lived in the San Fernando Valley and she had to go to Brentwood. It's a shorter drive. So we couldn't be happy enough here. And our daughter lives in Chicago, but works out of Washington, D.C., and comes to D.C. quarterly, and so visits us. Mm-hmm. So we just have it wonderfully here in St. Mary's County. And the other thing I'm up to is a few years ago, I don't even want to know how many, because I've been working on it for so long, a literary agent approached me about writing what it was like growing up in classic TV times with classic TV parents. And so I said, yeah, I'll do that. Never having been a writer except for Sunday sermons. And, I did a first draft, and she said, okay, we need a collaborator. And it took some time getting the right collaborator, but I have her now, and we are hopefully going to turn in the final draft at the end of July to our agent. And we'll see if the manuscript gets picked up or not. But that's been fun, and I've learned a little bit about my parents along the way, so it's enjoyable.
We were going to ask about the book, so I'm glad. So in July is when you're turning it in.
Yeah.
Hopefully it goes. So we'd love to read that.
I'm so tired of reading it. I've read it. I Frankensteined it. I had no discipline when I wrote it either. I was always told, write an outline. So I did an outline, and then I started writing it, but then stream of consciousness would happen, and I'd say, oh, this story would fit good here, and this story would fit good here. And it kind of wrote itself. But the problem is I couldn't remember which story was where, and if I had told this one already. And then when I got my first collaborator of the two, she said, this needs to be in chronological order. People don't like jumping around where you're talking about Father Knows Best, and then suddenly you're talking about Get a Life, and then you're back to Bewitched, or say, you're zigzagging. So I then had to Frankenstein it all back into an order, and it's a mess. And I'm so tired of reading it.
Well, hopefully it does go. How is your mom doing?
Very well. She is 86 and living with my stepfather, Lou, in Palm Desert, California. She, as I said, retired quite a while ago now. It's been probably 6 years or so. She just said, that's it. And yeah, she's in good health, which is great. She's always been, she was a dancer. I think she danced before she could talk. So she's been healthy her whole life and slim. So yeah, she's good and she's happy.
Well, that's great. Peter, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. We're looking forward to it. It's such a treat to get to hear all your stories. Love them. And I hope you get the book done. We'd love to have you back when that happens to talk about that. But again, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate meeting you both and seeing you again, Ike.
Yeah, definitely. Where are my fries?
That's it. Sorry.
Well, this has been Pop Culture Retro. I'm Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann. And again, a very special thanks to Peter Ackerman. And please subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Retro, where no one was hurt during the making of this podcast.